Hello, this is Dan, the furniture repairman. Today we're working on an Eames lounge chair that has a broken shock mount. The chair itself has four shock mounts, two on the left, two on the right. We're going to go through breaking down the chair, removing the shock mount, and how to replace it. I like to take the chair apart by putting it on its back first. It's much easier. Then we have to take the armrests off. The armrests are held on by two screws underneath. They're either going to be a Phillips head or an Allen screw. If they're an Allen screw, what I'd recommend is using an Allen wrench that has a ball on the end of it, because the angle of the screw itself to reach in there, quite often you're hitting the wood on the side and can't get a good purchase in there. This is what the end of the Allen wrench looks like. It'll make your life a lot easier if you get one of these. I like to put the screws back in the armrest for safekeeping. These are the metal armrests that hold the base to the top. You have to keep note of these screw holes right here because there's a difference from the right to the left, and if you get them reversed, you'll have a difficult time. These are the screws you're going to remove. These attach to the base. These attach to the backrest. Again, they're either going to be Phillips heads or they're going to be Allen screws. Okay, we're going to use our Allen wrench. Take the brackets off. Very simple to do. Then we're going to separate the chair. Okay, so here's the shock mount that remained attached, and here's where it pulled off. Now there's four shock mounts per chair. I go and test the other three. I really look at them, see if they're old and cracked, or if the glue's giving away, or if they move at all. If they look bad, then I replace them. Now I like to remove the cushions before I do the repair, mostly so that I don't damage the cushions with epoxy or anything else, or maybe even slicing the leather. The cushions, if it's a regular Eames chair, usually have one snap on them and a bunch of hooks. And you got to look underneath the cushion and see where the snap is. Now, on a seat, it's always in the back. But an ottoman, you can't tell the back of the ottoman from the front, so you got to kind of look underneath and see if you can see where the snap is. So here, we're going to zoom in on the snap right underneath this cushion here. There it is right there. And it's just a very simple snap. You just reach in, give it a quick pop, and it should be good. Now, if it's not an Eames chair, if it's a different brand, then it may be attached with screws or something like that. So the first thing I would look to see if there's screws coming through the bottom that are holding the cushions on if you can't recognize the Eames chair right away. Now, to get the cushion out, you have to push it uphill so it gets attached with some hooks that hold it in place. And some of these guys have been sitting there for 15 years. So the leather really gets stuck to the wood. So you almost have to work it a little bit, give it a few slaps. These are the hooks that attach the cushion, and there's the snap right there that we unsnapped. And then on a seat, there's typically 5 hooks. Now it's important that the shock mounts are mounted at the same angle and the same distance in the same place, left side to right. If you don't mount them the same way, what's going to happen is one shock mount is going to end up taking more stress every time somebody sits down in the chair, and it'll probably end up having a shorter lifespan and break off. I could tell by the lines of these two shock mounts that they were mounted on different angles, and it's probably what caused this one here to fail. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure the shock mount that we're not replacing, the one that we're leaving, the existing one, and we're going to copy that over to the other side. So I put a little blue tape here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the shock mount on the other side in two places. I'm going to measure it from uh, the front spot, from the shock mount to the top, and from the back. And then I'm going to move those over to this side. So now I'm going to spin this around. Now, if I was doing this and not making a video, I wouldn't be spinning it. I'm just spinning it so that you can see what I'm doing here. So It's very simple. I'm just going to use a combination square. I'm going to go right here, slide my square down, tighten it up, and I'm going to bring that distance over and mark it on this side right over here. So now I'm going to spin it so that you can see, and I'm going to place my combo square right there, make a small little line, and then I've switched a very accurate distance over. I'm going to do the same for the back, same exact technique. So now I have my neighbor's dog coming to visit. He needs to be petted a little bit, say hello to him. He's a wonderful, friendly guy. And then I'm going to do my measurements. So I'm going to use my combination square, measure the back of the chair now, the back of the shock mount, and we're going to spin that around, make a mark on the other side, and then we'll have the angle and distance copied over. That's very important. Take your time with this part. Also, make sure you understand how far back the shock mount has to go from the edge. All those things are going to make a big difference in the way the chair looks at the end and the way it functions, because the shock mounts are in at the same spot at the same angle. Every time you sit in the chair, they're going to share the stress that's put on it. But if one's a little off, then it's going to end up taking the stress first, which is probably going to cause it to fail much quicker than the other side. Now, I like to work with the piece on its side. With the base, it's very easy. I just take it, leave the legs on, and turn it on its side. Now I'm going to take my razor knife and I'm going to cut on the line. And what it's going to do, I'm going to remove the excess tape. It's going to leave me a very easy to see guideline that I could follow when I install my shock mount. If you look close, you'll see that the mark from the old shock mount sits a little different than the mark we have with our blue tape right here. There's a little bit of a separation. So the two shock mounts weren't mounted at the same angle. And again, that's probably one of the things that created this shock mount from popping off, because every time someone sat in it, it caught the weight before the other one. So we're going to mount them so they're at the same angle. We need to create a good reference line so that we can follow it when we re-glue the new shock mount in place. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my shock mount that I'm putting on there, my new one. I try not to reuse the old ones, mostly because the rubber gets harder over time, loses its flexibility, and that'll cause it to pop also. So I'm going to put my shock mount that I'm installing here on there. I'm going to make a Sharpie line all the way around it, and I'm going to have a very good spot that I could see easily where I need to prep and get it ready for the glue. Now, prepping for the glue is very important. We're going to take a Dremel and score a bunch of lines. It's going to create teeth. I'm going to force my epoxy into those lines so when it dries, it's going to create a very strong bond for that shock mount to adhere to. The other thing I'm going to do is sand the area that the shock mount is going to go onto. Remove any old glue, remove any of the old shock mount that may be stuck there. So I get down to some fresh wood. That way, my epoxy is going to penetrate into that fresh wood and stick to it. If I try to put it on top of the old epoxy and the old epoxy pulls off, then I'm going to weaken the bond. Now I'm going to Dremel the lines in a bit of a hashtag pattern. I'm not going to go very deep. I don't want to be carving into the strength of the wood. I just really want to be cutting some lines. It's going to create an extra surface area by the lines, and it's going to create teeth. Maybe a 16th, if that, just a little under that. And I tend to use a little bit of a thicker circular blade on my Dremel, so it creates a nice line that the epoxy can be forced into. If they're too thin, the epoxy won't be able to go in there and do it. And there you see my pattern there. It's not artistic. It's just something that I do to make sure it all works out well. As a close-up of the pattern, you can get a good look at it. Nothing fancy, not pretty, but it really will make a big difference. All right, so now I'm ready to prep my shock mount. This is the shock mount here. This particular brand has a metal back that has a lot of texture in the metal. I like this. I like this type of shock mount. We'll put a link where to get it. I'm cleaning the back with acetone. The reason why I'm doing this, if there's any oil or any residue left from machining on the back of that piece, I want to get rid of it. I want my epoxy to go and really stick into that shock mount. I don't want it to be held off by oil or anything else that happened when they made this piece. Now, the first tool I use is kind of a funny one. This is actually a clam knife. It's used to open clams. But the epoxy paste we work with is very thick and very hard to mix. You need a piece of steel to mix it. And this clam knife actually belonged to my grandfather. It's probably almost 100 years old. And my father had it in his toolkit forever. And we'd use it for all sorts of things, cleaning auto parts. And this is our epoxy here. We'll put a link to it. All right, all the work and preparation is done. It's finally time to pop these puppies open and get some epoxy mixed up and get this shock mount glued on. Now, what I'm going to do is take the top off of this. The black epoxy, the black color, is very sticky and very thick. So I'm going to use my clam knife, scrape it off the lid, get some going on my little cardboard palette here. And here you can see what I'm doing is I'm using a tongue depressor to get the white part of this off. And the reason is if I stick my clam knife in there with all the black epoxy in there, then what I'm going to do is end up getting the two epoxies in one pot and it's going to contaminate. I'm going to end up with a huge lump of epoxy inside that pot, which is basically just going to be garbage. And just like you can see right now with this clam knife, I'm really working on mixing this. It's not easy to do. You could use a piece of cardboard. A lot of people like to use a piece of wood because it's so thick, and I like it because it really is very sticky. What you're looking for is for the color to be even throughout. It should be this gray color. That's what I like about this epoxy because with the white and the black, you'll know you have it completely mixed when the color is even throughout the whole thing. So it's a slow set epoxy. There's no need to rush. Take your time and get it thoroughly mixed up. And I'm going to start pressing the epoxy into the wood. And I'm really going to work it in there. You're going to see me press it in. It's going to sometimes roll back off, and you're really going to have to press it down. This is not going to flow anyplace. This stuff is thick. It's like working with taffy. So if you want it to be someplace, if you want it to be in a groove, you've got to press it in the groove. Do not count on the clamp pressing it in for you. That doesn't happen. And the reason why that doesn't happen is there's going to be air inside that groove. And if you just skim the epoxy over the top and you trap the air inside the groove, then it's never going to come out. I don't care how tightly you clamp that because the air is going to be sealed in there and that epoxy is never going to go inside that groove. So if you want that epoxy in the groove, you've got to butter it inside that groove. And you can see me working it back and forth, back and forth. I'm making sure I have it all in there. I got my nice tape line here, which keeps me from going over the top edge. And I'm going to be able to measure back and forth each time when I clamp this down. I'm going to measure and make sure my shock mount hasn't slid around on me. So right now I'm kind of evening it all out. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put epoxy on the back of the shock mount also. And the reason why we put epoxy on both pieces is that we found over the years, every now and then a piece will come back where the shock mount has popped off. And the reason why the shock mount popped off is because there was no epoxy there, even though there was plenty on there. So we realized that what we were doing was we were getting air trapped between the shock mount and the epoxy. And as we clamped it down, there was no place for the air to go, so it just simply pushed the epoxy out along the edges. So we saw the epoxy getting squeezed out. We thought we had a very good fit there, but actually what we had was a little bit of an air bubble in between the shock mount and the epoxy. Now, when we butter the back of the shock mount like this, we get a much better chance of the epoxy adhering to itself. So we're going to press epoxy onto epoxy. It's not going to be a very, very flat surface that lets it trap air. The air is going to squeeze out. And if you're at all unsure if you've got that down, then once you clamp that piece down, take your clamp knife and take the clamp off and pry it back off and see if you have just it clinging to each other, even if you can get it off. Okay. The other thing you do is try to wiggle it around a little bit and see how stubborn it is about moving. Um, but don't be fooled by just the squeeze out along the sides. Always put the adhesive on both pieces when you're putting it together. It's so very important. Now I'm taking the shock mount and I'm dropping it in place. I'm keeping an eye on that black Sharpie line I made earlier. I want to make sure I have that in the right place. And then later on, I'm actually going to cover that line up with some more epoxy. I'm going to force in with my finger. But right now, what I'm going to do is line it up on my tape edge there, make sure I have a good fit, and I'm pressing it down and I'm wiggling it down into place. Now, I don't want to over squeeze this down because if you squeeze out too much of the epoxy, it's actually not going to work correctly. So if you read the manufacturer's specs on this product, that's one of the things they warn you about. You have to have a certain amount of epoxy between the two pieces. If you squeeze out too much of it, then it loses strength. So every now and then it pays, read the manufacturer's specs on how to use the product, and then hopefully you'll get it right. Here you see me with my fingers. Now I'm just kind of creating a little bit of a cove around this whole piece. We found that that also helps keep the shock mount in place over time. It just creates a little bit more strength to the shock mount that it'll have to press against that epoxy and it won't wiggle around so much. And now I'm taking this trusty clam knife, my 100-year-old clam knife. I think that may be my oldest tool, which is kind of hilarious, and cleaning off the tape edge right there. Now what I'm going to do is take the screws out of the shock mount. The reason why I leave the screws in the shock mount during this whole time is to prevent any epoxy from getting in on the threads on the inside, which makes you have to retap those holes, which is no fun. So it's much easier to leave the screws in. It'll keep the threads protected and then take them out just before you clamp the piece up. Now I'm going to pull the tape off and now I'm going to come in with my clamp, and it's not a C clamp. This is just a little bit of a pistol clamp with some rubber bumpers on the end. So I'm not applying too much force to this. Just a little bit of a light squeeze, and the shock mount is going to want to move as I do this. So I have to make sure I position the clamp in a way that it doesn't push the shock mount out of position. I'm going to squeeze it down just a tiny bit. I'm not looking for clamping pressure here. All I'm looking to do is to hold it in position while it dries. And one of the things I will tend to do is once I have it clamped, is probably not touch it or move it for at least a day. After a day, I could take the clamps off and the epoxy is well set up, it won't move. But that's kind of what I want. I want it just to hold it in position. I'm not trying to squeeze it down. Now, the last thing I do is to actually take my clamps back off. It's not going to pop off or anything like that. Epoxy is going to be holding it in place. And I'm going to check my shock mount position. So what I did is I used my combination square against the top of this guy, and I know where I'm supposed to be lying. And then I'm going to look down there, and if I could see my black lines, but usually they're covered a little bit with the epoxy, so I can't use them anymore. And I'm going to adjust my shock mount so it lines up the same as the shock mount on the top. And you can see me do that right there, that little bit of a micro adjustment. And then I'm just cleaning this epoxy out of the way, and I'm checking my distances there, make sure I'm good. And then I'm going to apply my second clamp, and I'm going to make sure I get it on there um, perpendicular to the piece. That way it doesn't pull down any when it tightens. And I don't need to tighten it that much. I just need to kind of hold that shock mount in place and keep it from lifting off of itself. It's a very important step. And I will sometimes go back after 10 minutes and eyeball it and make sure it hasn't moved at all, because it will tend to creep on you. And that'll cause problems in the way the chair functions. This is where we're going to end our video. Putting it back together is just reversing the process of taking it apart. Make sure you let your epoxy dry for a good 48 hours. You can take the clamps off the next day, but really make sure that epoxy is good and dry. If you'd like to see some of our other work, some of our before and after pictures, you can find us at danthefurniturerepairman.com. Also, please remember to like the video and subscribe and hit that notification button. And every time we do a repair, we post it, you'll see our techniques. Thank you so much for watching. Much appreciated.